unstable, but part of the reason he was unstable was the guilt. He realised that he was kind of complicit in the death of a child. He put his career first. Yeah? So look at the images of journalists in Hollywood films. They're all heroes, aren't they? Yeah? And that's often the way journalists do see themselves, as like making political statements, but they parachute into the country and they leave very quickly, and they don't actually engage with what's happening on the ground. Yeah? Which is sometimes to do with a time constraint, obviously, because we all know not only do journalists not have time to tell the story in any complexity or depth, but, you know, to investigate, to research, but they only have, like, you know, a couple of minutes to tell the story. You can't get the story in two minutes. But anyway, this is the point that the forgotten his name, Charlie, I think it's Charlie someone, the guy, he's saying that the old definition of journalism was that there has to be a distance between the journalist, the camera, and the subject matter. Now, in 2024, the distance is much closer, yeah? Or maybe not so much in Palestine, but it's very interesting to see, well, we'll come back to that, because maybe that's something we can discuss and you can challenge. But I just want you to think in terms of journalism and distance. Is it good that a journalist should be far away from the event that he or she is reporting? Doesn't that stop him from having a moral relationship, an ethical relationship with the subject matter? Yeah? You know, we're also witnessing the world through the screen. The journalist is closer, yeah? But the journalist himself or herself is often not close enough to really understand what's going on. Anyway, we'll come back to that a bit more.
That goes way beyond just the simple fact. I think there are two strange things going on in the world at the moment. On the one hand, people are really worried about the idea of fake news, propaganda. On the other hand, people really like news that's got more of a personal touch, that's more committed or more emotional, that relates to them as a human being.
This is the Dragax method of blindfolding people to avoid attention. Just eye patches and sunglasses.
The old idea that journalists created almost in a laboratory objective news products which were then passed out to the public, that's changed. It's a much more interactive, complex process. In some ways, the old classic idea of objectivity, where you spoke in a neutral language, you made sure that all your images were carefully, formally composed, has been replaced by a much more kind of informal grammar around journalism. In some ways, people trust authenticity. They like to see material that comes directly from the public themselves.
Authenticity means truthfulness.
Grainy iPhone video clip more than they would a beautifully filmed professional image. So, in a sense, that kind of directness, that kind of openness, gives a kind of authenticity which is almost more important than that classic scientific idea of objectivity. It allows them to create quite melodramatic situations where they may be actually becoming actors themselves.
Him there on the ground, captured on my TV camera. If he stays there, he might get killed. Pick him up, carry him to the barricade. Blood is pouring from his head.
So what we have here, in contrast to the previous examples, is a African news story CNN report where the journalist is literally helping the person in the story and getting the story at the same time, yeah? Which is very different from the classical examples. I won't play the rest of it now because there's a lot more to go through, but you're very welcome to watch this yourselves on YouTube because it's available on YouTube. Let's go back to the notes. So, I am contrasting two different types of journalism. One that I'm calling civil inattention, which is more likely to be try to be objective and fits a pluralist model, and one that is more critical and where the journalist puts him or herself into the story. So, for example, one of the main people that I interviewed for my PhD research was John Simpson, and what he said in his defence of BBC objectivity, and you can agree or disagree, it's up to you, but he said the reason why he uses objectivity, he says it's not his job to manipulate the audience, to give them a political message. Not my job. So the audience, do you remember that's the pluralist thing? Let the audience decide.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense in many ways, you know, in terms of advertising and so on, but it's a market model. If you let the audience decide what's happening in Palestine based on the way Palestine is reported, they will think, yes, it's right that we kill all the Palestinians because they're all potential terrorists. So that the danger of objectivity is actually that it's a bias. It's an elite power bias. There is no objective journalism. The opposite example that I'm going to share with you later, who is John Pilger, who's independent. Unfortunately, he died recently, but he was in his 80s, so don't be upset. And he's also a very good documentary filmmaker. And he made a film, a documentary called The War You Don't See About Iraq, which is brilliant. And I'm going to show you a clip from that. So, from the perspective of journalists themselves, what I'm calling mainstream journalists, the ones who work for commercial news organizations like in this country Sky or CNN or NBC, ABC in the US, is that the news should be up to date, it's on here, relevant, socially relevant, important, and transparent and objective. And I'm contrasting this with critical independent journalists such as John Pilger, who, just like Marxists, political economists and Frankfurt School thinkers, argues that news is industrially produced. And the reason that news is often not done well is because journalists it's just like a job. You go into a country that's got a war, you point the camera, you interview one side, you interview the other, and then you file your report. It's not really very helpful, actually. That might be a simplification. Again, it's certainly a simplification of a colonial and apartheid war in Palestine. It's not 50-50, but we'll come back to that later. News creates particular versions of reality that fit within a capitalist market ideology. Yeah? Because news that's made by a commercial news media organization is more concerned with maximization of ratings, popularity. We talked about that with regard to Barbie, and profit. Yeah? So what happens ultimately, very sadly, is that profit comes before people. Profit, even a bad story, makes money. Just like all those weapons that are being used in the Middle East right now are mainly American. Yeah? Is that reported? No. I wonder why. So, one of the main theories of, so selection and construction. There are two main stages in the news-making process. Selection is the first one. Construction is the second. You get the verb select, you get the verb construct. Before a journalist constructs his or her news story, he or she has to decide what is the story, what's newsworthy. In the 1960s, a couple of media researchers called Galton and Ruger, they came up with a list of news values, which is basically what qualities does a news story have to make it important enough to report? And as you can see here, I've listed 5, I'm going to give you one more, of the most important news values. First one is frequency. The news has to be up to date. Even better than up to date, if it's happening now, it's very dramatic if it's happening now. We don't know what's going to happen, right? So think about 24-hour news networks, yeah? Strangely, if you watch 24-hour news, and you should if you haven't already, you actually get these loops, these cycles, where it's not really live, it's just saying the same thing over and over again. Proximity means that national news stories, local ones, take priority over foreign ones. This is why we have foreign correspondents. They are part of a classical model of our national news is very important. So we have a political correspondent, we have a social correspondent or a crime correspondent, and then one correspondent or a group of correspondents that report the world. It's all foreign, okay? That's a colonial perspective. Unambiguity, the story has to be clear, simple, so you can tell it quickly and people don't get confused. Unfortunately, the most important news stories today are not unambiguous. In other words, they're complex. Climate change, environmental destruction, war in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, artificial intelligence. You can't report those in a couple of minutes so people will understand them. So it's not a coincidence that the most important stories are not reported because they're too complex. Personalization means using human examples to illustrate a world event. So the classic example here is in a war, you interview a family that has been a victim of the war, people that are caught up in the war, witness people who are actually in the event rather than you, the journalist outside the event. Human interest. Is that more authentic? In many ways it is. Or is it more authentic? Because actually somebody who has just been bombed in Ukraine, they're going to be traumatized. Okay, so you're not really going to get a very rational perspective necessarily. So, but anyway, that's personalization. Negativity, we all know, sadly, bad news sells. Yeah? I think we could change that, but unfortunately, our culture, when I say our culture, I think I might be in Western culture, is habitually, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the horrible slogan. Television news. We started to talk about it with regard to the video I just shared with you. Stories must be visually illustrated and preferably exciting, i.e. dramatic. But when does an exciting, dramatic news story become overwhelming and bad for your mental health and politically manipulative? So this thing about emotion, we are getting more emotion in our news stories, but is the emotion being used well? Is it being used to shock, so you increase your audiences? Is it being used to manipulate? Yeah? So, gatekeeping, number 5, that's just basically the editors. So in terms of selection, editors have much more power than the journalists. If the journalists, you might file a story and the editor says, no, we can't broadcast that because it's too controversial. And the editor, or even the owner, will have the final say. Now, I haven't talked about construction, the second stage of the newsmaking process. Construction is how you put the story together. Obviously, a story can look very, very different if you use a camera. If you're just a press journalist and you're writing a news story with words, again, it might look or feel very different, the same event. So, and this is like McGilchrist. How you attend to the world changes what people understand about the world. How, not what's important, but how. So take these examples. Now I've used these examples, these are not real examples, but they could be real. I think you'll agree. So these are headlines. Compare if you will. Today, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, bombed southern Gaza, killing over 100 Palestinians and eliminating 12 Hamas terrorists. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like Israel's the good guys, terrorists killed, that's good. Okay, not so good killing 100 Palestinians, but maybe necessary because that's, it was a political objective. Compare that with, I'll get it up on the screen. So compare that with today, the IDF continued their illegal genocidal destruction of Palestine, executing 12 Hamas fighters and murdering over 100 Palestinian civilians. Believe it or not, guys, that is the same story.
Yeah.
Look at the use of language.
Yeah.
This is why language is very important in how we attend to the world. Yeah? Just something for you to think about. So this sets up the next clip, which is Al Jazeera English. Now it's from Listening Post, so I recommend that you all watch this every week. There's a new episode every week. This is from Al Jazeera English, and what's great about Listening Post is it talks about how the news covers the news. So it's critical about news, and this is this week's episode of the Listening Post. Mohammed Al-Kurd, which Noof already knows, he's a famous poet in Palestine as well as a journalist, being interviewed and making a very powerful critique of Western mainstream journalism that actually, I would argue, fits the propaganda model. Yeah? But see what you think.
We begin in The Hague, where justice passed Friday, the UN's top court.
Primarily, to distract that
Victim, head bowed, suffering politely. That comes through in our next piece, which takes the form of a kind of video essay. And I started by asking Mohammed Al-Kurd what, if anything, he's learned since October 7th.
I don't think I learned much about the world since October 7th. I think much of what I've already assumed about the world has been violently reinforced. The fact that there are hierarchies for lives, the fact that a person's death is a tragedy somewhere and another's death is a necessary evil. The fact that there is not a single threshold that the Israeli regime can cross that can make it condemnable in the eyes of empire. Not apartheid, not military occupation, not separate extension, not incremental genocide, and now not even full-blown genocide. My name is Mohammed Al-Kurd, and I'm a writer and journalist from Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. Palestinians have been facing challenges of censure, erasure, being misconstrued, being misinterpreted woefully, their words taken out of context, being vilified.
When terrorist leaders are assassinated?
No, it does not, because they are not terrorist leaders.
But I think in recent months, the approach has been a lot more unabashed and a lot more unapologetic, because this whole framework is racist.
This is a genocide happening in front of our eyes.
But that word is, as you know, incredibly emotive, and the Israelis, as you know, would be saying that they are targeting Hamas only, that they don't target civilians with a
Unfortunate.
plan.
This phenomenon that Palestinian words are misconstrued or placed out of context is not by chance, it is by design. And it's meant, ultimately, primarily, to distract from the tangible, systemic, institutional violence taking place on the ground. There is right now in Palestine a soldier berating someone, a soldier beating someone, a soldier most likely shooting at someone. There are bombs being dropped over the heads of Palestinians, and yet the conversations in the West are largely steered by abstractions and hypotheticals about words and language.
There's no way you can sit there and not condemn the actions of Hamas.
Then you can make it a mess of Israel. Will you now take the opportunity to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th? Final, I only ask you one more time.
We must refuse to engage these kinds of discursive loops that are meant to distract from the bombs being dropped, from the
Do you see
occupation,
what it's saying?
taking place.
What he's saying is so important, because what he's saying is that what the journalists are doing is they're saying to voices who are speaking up for Palestine, they're saying, okay, stop talking about Palestine. Do you condemn the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October? And they're basically trying to get the story to match the Israeli story. Yeah? It's not that the attacks weren't terrible. They were a crime against humanity. They were a war crime. They were disgusting. But there's no context what led to that, the war against Palestine that's been going on for decades, and the fact that it's become like a concentration camp and blah blah blah.
They're being. What I see is like they're trying to be forced to speak something that matches their own story, so that they actually shows the truth.
That's right. So I hope that illustrates for you the power of how basically objectivity can mean basically that journalists align corporate power with political power. Yeah. It's very powerful. Very powerful. Just a little bit more.
Driving into Gaza, the Israeli forces.
Palestinians are not asking journalists to do us any favors. We're simply asking them to do their jobs. The purpose of this profession is to tell the truth. And the facts on the ground are so clear. The asymmetry of power is so staggering. It simply cannot be misunderstood. So to fabricate nuance, to create layers that do not exist in reality. It's not just spinelessness, it's complicity.
Admiral, how are you?
I hear a lot from journalists who are working in mainstream institutions who say they wish they could do better. How they see
This is a key point.